Welcome to Actual Context. Please, call me Actual. Mr. Context was my father. I'm just doing some research for the next big video that I'm planning, but I wanted to take a moment up front to offer some important information about the one you're about to watch. The Punisher police problem is the first subject that I thought of when I was creating this channel. The phenomenon of cops using the Punisher symbol is in many ways a nexus of where we are in this country, and by extension, much of the world. Oppression, malevolence, violence, bigotry, mental health crises, the philosophy of good versus evil, systemic breakdown, identity, culture, both pop and otherwise, all wrapped up in a symbol, co-opted from a multi-billion-dollar corporate entity. I put a lot of work into this, dozens of hours of research. And not just on the Punisher. I studied statistics, trends, read about incidents of police violence and abuse, and it actually began to take a little psychological toll on me, which is why my content has been sparse and rather basic lately. This is important to me, and it should be to you. It goes so much deeper than just bastardized decals on cop cars. The Punisher being the Punisher and cops being cops, this video gets into some dark territory once we get into the real-life events connected to the Punisher and the police. I won't be showing anything overtly graphic, except for some movie clips. There will, however, be statistics, news footage, and headlines that may be disturbing to some people. It certainly was for me to research, to write, and record. But I promise you, on this copy of Conquest, with a signed Stan Lee comic on top, that after the more intense segments, I'll provide you with a palate cleanser, a digital hug. So take those moments to catch your breath, reset your defenses, and then we'll soldier on together. And finally, if you make sure to watch part 2 on Sunday, at the end of that video, you'll see exactly what big project I'm doing research for now. I'm really excited to get to work on it, and I think you'll find it extremely entertaining and revolutionary. Why do we love characters? Why do we connect with them? Relate to them? Why, when a beloved character triumphs or dies or just manages to get their chaotic life in order, do we feel that potent link to their actions? What effect does this have on who we are in our lives, and how far beyond the confines of the media we're consuming does that connection go? Every day, we experience the very human phenomena of empathy and sympathy. Empathy and sympathy are the two most powerful factors in how we respond to fictional characters. Social psychologists say that empathy allows us to experience another person's feelings by recreating their emotions using our own experiences as the framework.
Come on, Mr. Frodo. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. Come on!
So if you're watching Tony Stark die and can't stop that tear from bubbling to the corner of your eyelid, chances are you're drawing on your memory of a loved one you've lost, even if that's a pet you had or an artist you admired. Empathy then morphs into sympathy, our ability to realize that another person is experiencing pain, such as Peter Parker watching Tony Stark die. We then want to hug that dear sweet boy, hold him in our arms and make him some cocoa or something. Maybe that's just me. If a character is well written, well acted, well directed, our own empathy and sympathy work in tandem with what's on the screen or page, giving perspective on a fictional character. It can also give us insight into ourselves and others. We map our own unique experiences onto theirs, and in the process, we become connected. We relate to and identify with them, and we've done this for thousands of years, since the first humans told stories to one another. One could argue that relating to characters is a defining human trait. We like to identify with characters because it allows us to see ourselves and others in a more nuanced way. While we experience empathy and sympathy, we know they're not real people, so there's a safe distance between us and the unfolding events. We relate to the actions they perform and imagine ourselves in that moment. In the case of heroes, and we like to think we'd perform as heroically or as efficiently in similar circumstances. So when Tony Stark stealthily snatches the Infinity MacGuffins from Thanos and snaps the existential threat into oblivion, of course we don't imagine ourselves doing this in real life. Okay, maybe sometimes I do. It's probably good I don't have those rocks. But the resourcefulness, the heroism of choosing to make the world or your loved ones safe at great cost to yourself, we like to think we're capable of this. Even if we don't see ourselves in that heroic moment, we certainly connect with the weight of the sacrifice being made. And then comes adorable little Spider-Man, causing our perspective to shift, and we feel that loss more acutely for the same character we just held in highest regard as he made his sacrifice. It's a very well-rounded experience that way, letting us exist on both sides of this powerful narrative and character moment simultaneously. Through empathy and sympathy, we've engaged in an emotional and psychological exercise. We've touched our fingers to a complex tapestry of the human experience, and it only costs $15 and Martin Scorsese's pride. One way we express our connection to a character is to adorn ourselves in its iconography, or in capitalist terms, its branding, trademark, all rights reserved, movie next summer. I can't think of a good example right off the top of my Cap helmet, but let's say Batman's bat symbol. Everybody knows it, and most people actually seem to have positive feelings about Batman in general. He's a vigilante, but he doesn't kill. He's a product of a broken system, but he doesn't become the thing he is against. Or does he? There are arguments that Batman only makes Gotham worse, and in fact he feeds the cycle of madness by beating up victims of capitalism and mentally ill people. Also because he's super rich and could just spend his fortune and time any number of ways that would clean up the city. Run for office on a socialist platform, Bruce, you dingus. Those are valid points, maybe to be taken up on this channel at a later date. Batman is a relatable character to anybody who's suffered a trauma and gone on to have that trauma shape their perspective, or to people who dedicate themselves to disciplining their minds and bodies, people who are efficient or at least want to see themselves that way. Relating to a character is a vicarious practice, and it can inform us who we are, how we feel, and how we relate to the world. We may aspire to be like them, or at least a character trait or two that they possess. Han Solo's swagger, Tony Stark's resourcefulness, or Batman's dedication and efficiency. We see them as masters of their destinies, their fates only in their capable hands. And we want to feel that way about ourselves. And in the moments that we empathize and sympathize with those characters, even if the rest of our lives are complete chaos and misery, we're able to grasp just a sliver of our own fate too. Some characters we relate and aspire to, and yet others are meant to be cautionary tales or commentaries on social systems. The network of relationships that exists between individuals, people, groups, and institutions. A person might belong to multiple social systems at once, many overlapping and dependent on the others. Family, communities, cities, college campuses, industries, governments, and economies are all social systems. These types of characters are written and portrayed as products of those systems, and they give us a safe glimpse into the lives of those less fortunate, those who suffer under unjust systems, apathetic systems, broken systems. Batman is a fascinating character because he can be seen as two sides of a broken system. Yes, he's the rich guy who never worries about food or a place to live and is able to choose any path in life despite his immense trauma, because he has the wealth and resources to do anything he wants. But he's also the son of parents who were murdered right in front of him by a product of broken systems. Depending on who's telling the story and which aspect is focused on, Batman can be viewed as a relatable, inspiring character, or a traumatic result of criminality, which in turn is a result of an unfair capitalist system. When done with excellence, Batman is both at once, but not all characters are quite so multifaceted. Calling back to the Watchmen video that probably got your attention to this channel, Rorschach is the result of poverty, an abusive, toxic family system, and a society in which deranged and damaged people wear masks and kick the asses of criminals. His unprocessed trauma has led him to believe he has a righteous moral code, when in reality he's merely perpetuating an unhealthy system and expressing his trauma through violence and murder. His moral code is warped, as seen in his journal where he writes murder porn and judges people for sins he whimsically applies based on his own perverted notions of decency. He may be breaking the necks of killers, but he's making these judgments based on very askew perspective. And that perspective is informed by the broken system of which he is a result. Tyler Durden is a product of the existential void created by late-stage capitalism, unhealthy masculinity, and a society that doesn't encourage the mindful accountability of our mental health. In fact, society would prefer we go to work, mind our manners, and act like all is well. Nothing to see here, just an isolated, angry young man with an unhealthy perspective of the world, stuck in an unrewarding loop. Speaking of society, did you know we live in one? Joker, at least the version depicted in the Oscar-nominated film of last year, is a product of an apathetic, often cruel world that exists for the poor and those with unique personal challenges. Arthur Fleck suffers under the shroud of a decaying city, unlucky enough to be born with a rare medical condition and to either an insane woman or as the bastard son of the richest man in town, who just wants to forget Arthur exists. Either way, Arthur was handed a raw deal and at every turn is met with indifference or animosity because he doesn't fit in. He doesn't matter to the system. In fact, he kind of makes the system uncomfortable. So the system is intent on purging him one way or another, until he decides to embrace his outsider nature in the most violent and public way. Then, in his mind, Fleck has beaten the system that hates him, but he's not supposed to be admired for his actions. He's intended to shine a light on Gotham's broken systems which look oddly familiar to our real-world systems. This is the purpose of a commentary character such as Rorschach, Tyler Durden, or Joker, to ask us to empathize with someone who's suffered under a broken system, so that we might examine said system in a new way. But we're only intended to relate to a character like this insofar as they are humans experiencing pain and trauma, isolation and alienation. When Rorschach decides to beat up an elderly former criminal cancer patient in his home, or cleave open dog and child killer skulls, we see that he's lost himself to the same system that created him. He's not solving anything. He's processing his trauma for selfish reasons. It just happens to be against people we either don't care about or we think deserve a terrible fate. The moment Durden starts assaulting or kidnapping people, blowing up buildings, no matter how much we relate to his perspective before that point, we should reflect on that system, not aspire to do the same. When Joker kills those Wall Street guys, as momentarily cathartic as it may be, he may still get our empathy, but he's no longer earning our sympathy. He's succumbed to the system, and now decides to be part of the same system that perpetuates violence onto others. And in this version, his actions indirectly lead to the deaths of Bruce Wayne's parents. And as we explored a minute ago, Bruce then becomes a cog in that machine as well. The cycles repeat, spin off new unhealthy functions of the system that created them, and we're left no better than before. The same class of people still suffer under those systems, and those same systems don't even notice. The purpose of characters such as these is to examine systemic conditions around people that abuse, exploit, and fail them, not to relate unconditionally. So what happens when the people we trust with our security, our safety, the men and women who take oaths to protect our communities, miss the point of such a character? What is the result when powerful agents of an already unfair system embrace the mentality and iconography of these characters? How does the system react when officers of law enforcement aspire to be like a character who's meant to be a cautionary tale against the very system of which they are a function? It's a problem.
Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you?
The 1960s were Marvel's birth era, at least in terms of the brand that it's established for itself and the iconic characters that went on to become the most popular films across the globe. The 60s brought us Spider-Man, Thor, Hulk, Doctor Strange, the Fantastic Four, and this little mashup team called the Avengers. Marvel stories and characters have long been a reflection of the world outside our window, with all the heightened reality that comes with radioactive spiders, super soldier serums, and gamma-irradiated green monsters. In the 60s, those popular characters were inspired by the atomic age, the advancements of science, and notions of social progress that took root in that decade. But in the 70s, politics became cynical, films got grittier and darker. The comic book heroes of the 60s didn't use guns or kill people, but the 70s saw the rise of popular films like Taxi Driver, Dirty Harry, and Death Wish. So when Stan Lee passed the mantle of Spider-Man writer to Jerry Conway, Conway wanted to explore those types of violent, murderous vigilantes like Travis Bickle and Dirty Harry? Is that his name? Whatever. Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson's boomer-style responses to growing crime rates and urban decay. Taxi Driver is dope and should never be lumped into the same category as these others, but like those films, they are a product of their time. The public began its love affair with vigilantes in the 1970s, brought on by real-life vigilantes like Bernard Goetz. So Marvel did what it does best and reflected the times. Enter Frank Castle, aka the Punisher. The Punisher was introduced in Amazing Spider-Man number 129 as an antagonist to the Wallcrawler. Punisher's code was pretty simple. The police, the courts, the entire justice system was ineffective. Frank's answer to crime wasn't to spin them up in webs and call the cops. It was an approach with more finality. He acted as judge, jury, and executioner, and wearing an ever so subtle skull on his chest. He set about ridding the city streets of what he saw as thugs, gangsters, drug pushers. And in his first appearance, Spider-Man. Frank was deceived by the villain Jackal, who told him Spidey was a criminal, which technically he is, but not in the way that Frank Castle thought. The Punisher enacts violent vigilante justice upon those who commit violence against the innocent. So when he realized Spider-Man was not the villain he believed him to be, the Punisher formed an uneasy alliance with the Webhead. In his very first appearance, a guy with a hard-on for murder and a fetish for guns and ammo was easily duped into becoming a hitman, determined to kill a man he knew nothing about except rumors and agenda-driven gossip. The Punisher is an Italian-American vigilante whose methods include murder, kidnapping, extortion, coercion, threats of violence, and torture in his campaign against crime. He's motivated by circumstances not dissimilar from most traditional comic book heroes. The deaths of his wife and 2 children. Frank Castle is a war veteran and a United States Marine Corps scout sniper in Force Recon. He employs his training in hand-to-hand combat, guerrilla warfare, and marksmanship to wage his one-man war on crime. No due process, no mercy, just bullets by the dozens. Jerry Conway initially created the Punisher as a one-off antagonist for Spider-Man. Countless characters throughout comic history have served the purpose of spicing up the books for an issue or two, and then are swiftly forgotten. But there was something about the Punisher that appealed to readers of those days. People who could see that society was changing rapidly from the peace-love 60s into something more violent, less optimistic. And so, capitalism being what it is, Marvel seized on this unexpected demand for the Punisher. After appearing in Daredevil issues and again with Spider-Man several times, the Punisher eventually got his own limited series in March 1986 by Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck. Limited series are often proving ground for an unproven property. This limited series saw the first instance of something we'll explore later on in the video, an attempt by Marvel to make the Punisher more commercially viable. It was explained via retcon, or retroactive continuity, that Frank's most violent acts in the past had been the result of mind-altering drugs he was given against his knowledge. This retcon allowed Marvel to depict the Punisher in a more heroic, less barbaric light. He showed some mercy, and he was more reasonable, despite still just totally fucking murdering dudes in the mob. These attempts to declaw Frank Castle over the years have been received as warmly as a popsicle to your back. The Punisher's violent nature and penchant for murder made him a unique presence in the mainstream American comic books when he debuted, but by the end of the 80s, he was part of a cultural fixation on psychologically troubled anti-heroes. At the height of his popularity, the character was featured in 4 monthly comic titles: The Punisher, Punisher War Journal, Punisher War Zone, and The Punisher Armory. But let's take a step back and see what brought Frank Castle to take up his war on crime. Frank Castle's origin story begins when he tried being a priest, but gave up his quest for the cloth when he began to question why God would allow hatred and suffering in the world, such as the carnage in Vietnam. This is the first example of Frank wanting to make the world a better place, and sadly finding himself victim to an exploitative system that puts young men through a meat grinder for the nebulous purpose that is liberty. Unfortunately, Frank Castle thought the best way to help the problems he saw was to become part of the problem. He joined the Marines. Castle served 4 tours of duty in Vietnam, earned several commendations including the Purple Heart, and was briefly taken prisoner of war. His captor was a Viet Cong soldier called Monkey, who wore a skull medallion around his neck. Frank escaped and used the skull symbol to taunt Monkey as he killed his way through the enemy soldiers in his POW camp. This event served as one of a few catalysts that created the infamous Punisher, and that skull symbol would become his icon, his mark upon the world. Due to the sliding timescale of Marvel Comics, in which nobody really gets older, every decade or two, some events have to be retconned to fit within contemporary life. So, later on, Frank's war was Afghanistan instead of Vietnam. The effect on Castle was virtually the same. Severe PTSD, like what many of our military friends now suffer from, and a government that has no qualms sending young men to kill and die, even though they won't allow funding necessary to help them heal and recover from the traumatic memories they incurred. Here was a man who began with the best intentions, to minimize suffering and serve his country, failed by the United States' goal of fighting proxy wars in Southeast Asia, as well as its jingoistic notions of blind patriotism, lucky enough to make it home, but unlucky enough for home to be an apathetic nation with little to no resources for treating and healing the people it so boldly calls heroes. And yet Frank found love back home and married a kind woman named Maria, with whom he had 2 children. Despite his trauma, Frank pushed forward to find a semblance of peace. Maria and the kids, Lisa and Frank Jr., provided Frank Sr. comfort in a way he hadn't known before. But as we know, that fortune only lasted so long. When the Castle family set up a picnic in Central Park to celebrate Frank being awarded another chunk of metal for his actions at war, the unthinkable happened. Well, unless you know this story, then I guess it's pretty thinkable. But bear with me for the normies out there. A drug deal gone wrong nearby in the park was seen by the Castle family. The drug traffickers needed to silence the witnesses, so the family was ordered to be executed. Only Frank survived. Castle was able to identify the men responsible to the police, but the mobsters involved were able to pull the strings of corrupt cops and officials, halting the investigation in its tracks. When soon after a hitman was sent to finish the job, Frank realized that another system had failed him. The justice system. Recalling his escape from the POW camp, Frank Castle spray-painted a big white skull on his chest and set out for what he believed would be a suicide mission. He expected, and probably wanted, to die while serving his own brand of justice. And in a typical anti-hero tale such as Falling Down starring Michael Douglas, the story would end after Frank completed his mission. He would die or be locked up for his crimes. But this was just the beginning for the Punisher. Castle continued to kill everyone involved or connected to the mob responsible for his family's death, but once he checked them off his list, he knew he couldn't quit. He doubled down and dedicated himself to dispatching every criminal that the law let slip through its fingers. The problem with this, despite seeming like a net win for society at first glance, is that there are any number of reasons why alleged criminals might go free. Castle wasn't checking DNA evidence or doing thorough investigations for the most part. He would just hear of a mobster or alleged killer walking from a plea deal or even on parole and punish them with absolute prejudice. This was later somewhat corrected by the addition of the character Microchip, who acted as Frank's eyes and ears via various technologies and resources. This allowed him to be more informed of who he's targeting and even prevent crimes in some cases. But at the end of the day, the Punisher was just a cold-blooded murderer with no authority and driven by unimaginable grief and trauma. Castle makes efforts to not harm police officers, and though he finds them annoying, he even partners up with costume heroes like Wolverine, Spider-Man, and Daredevil. Most traditional superheroes regard Frank with caution, and some have even tried to bring him to justice themselves to answer for his scores of murders. Here's where I tell you about my personal feelings about the Punisher. As your friendly internet Marvel expert with some level of appreciation for virtually every character in their stable. The Punisher's solo stories can be engaging in a grounded way, as opposed to skin-tight spider-themed costumes and blind lawyers who are also experts at martial arts, but I usually get kind of bored after an issue or two and find myself struggling to invest in a storyline or stay connected to the character. The reason is that the Punisher is pretty one-note. Not like Spider-Man, who's driven by the guilt of his failings to make the world a better place, or Daredevil, who's often pretty violent but never kills, and paradoxically tries to adhere to his Catholic upbringing. These are layers that can be explored, folded into one another, and expanded in interesting ways. Captain America, who we'll get to later on, was a physically weak man granted superhuman ability, so he dedicates himself to upholding the values inherent to America's founding documents. Cap has and does kill on occasion, but it's typically in the context of war, and almost always some brand of fascists like Hydra or just straight up Nazis. So who cares about them? I mean, other Nazis, I guess, or the dimwits who unironically say both sides or it's just a different opinion. To me, the Punisher works best when juxtaposed against his more heroic counterparts. When he and Spider-Man team up, Spider-Man spends half the time trying to keep Frank from killing people. It's actually a pretty fun way to explore both characters, as we can see the moral failings of Frank's methods compared to the more humane, less insane way Spider-Man fights crime. You may be getting ready to type a comment right now that's like, Frank's method is final. Spider-Man's enemies always come back from jail and do crimes again. No. Stop. It's true that Spider-Man's methods aren't a permanent solution in most cases, but Punisher creates more dysfunction in the same system that made him at an exponential rate. The murdered criminals, assuming they're the worst kind of people and do more harm alive, still have families and are usually connected to a much larger organization. His brand of violence perpetuates trauma onto the survivors, as well as the public at large who scarcely see the difference between two types of killers. The history of organized crime shows us that in many cases, if one of their own is taken out, the mob intentionally escalates with retaliatory violence, sometimes indiscriminately against any and everyone, sometimes just to make a point. So in actuality, the effects of the Punisher, if he really existed, would be about the same as a rival gang going to war with one another. Blood in the streets, escalation, retaliation, innocent victims, cycle repeats. Is it even really possible to have a healthy connection to such a character? Who does the Punisher appeal to? It has to be someone, because he keeps getting solo series, however short-lived, and most recently, a fairly well-received Netflix show. Before that, there were some cartoon appearances with the violence toned way down, and 2 feature films in the 2000s. One starring Thomas Jane, which is PG-13 violent, but explores the psychology of Frank pretty well. If you're more interested in the psychology than the bloodshed, it's a decent film to watch. Solid B-. The other is 2008's Punisher Warzone with Ray Stevenson looking every inch the part of Frank Castle. But this film is a hard R, hyper-focused on over-the-top violence at the expense of character, and acting, and story. Yeah, this was actually the only Marvel movie, and one of only a handful of movies ever, that I walked out of halfway through. I'm a horror fan, and I love some well-done cinematic gore, which this has, but otherwise it was a mind-numbingly bad experience that I forgot until I had to find clips for this video. But hey, the clips serve my purposes quite well to showcase the man, the myth, the Punisher. Neither film was well received and exploded the possibility of a Punisher film series like a shotgun to the face, or a chair to the face. I guess if you're just into super gritty crime drama with buckets of blood and bullets, being entertained by the Punisher's hijinks can be a healthy pastime. I'm not against absurd violence in fictional entertainment, but I do prefer it to have some other thematic purpose. I enjoyed his appearance on the Daredevil show quite a bit, but mostly because of the reason I said earlier. He was cleverly written to be an indictment on the failed systems that created him, and set up as a narrative inverse to Daredevil himself. I mean, not to mention, John Bernthal was kind of born to play Frank Castle.
I'm not crazy, okay? I know what I did. I know who I am, and I do not need your help. I'm smack dab in the middle of my right goddamn mind, and any scumbag, any lowlife, any maggot piece of shit that I put down, I did it because I liked it. Hell, I loved it. I'm sitting here, I'm just itching. I'm itching to do it again. And you think what? You think you're gonna send me to a nut house Some doctor they're gonna get me to stop from doing what I want to do? Well, that ain't happening. Not on my watch. You people, you call me the Punisher, ain't that right? The big bad Punisher. Here I am! You want it?
Remove the witness.
I am the Punisher. I'm right here. You want it? I'll give it to you.
I actually recommend that season if you want to see the best depiction of our skull-clad subject. But to see the Punisher as a genuine hero, or to fantasize about his methods as somehow good for society, is a flawed and pretty dangerous perspective. His iconography, trademark, registered trademark, copyright 1974 Marvel Entertainment subsidiary of the Walt Disney Corporation, is undeniably cool. It's simple, it's stark, and it leaves no doubt as to who's coming for you or what your fate will be as an alleged criminal. And oh boy does it appeal to men who think masculinity means aggressiveness, edginess, and a fuck you mentality. It certainly appealed to me at one point, when I was 13 years old and angry at my parents. I've talked to people, however, who don't think of the Punisher as much different than Batman. In fact, a few have said Frank is the more efficient hero. And not to be a gatekeeper, because I don't think you need to know every detail of a story to be a fan of something, but these kinds of people, always dudes, are in the most literal sense pretenders. They clearly know next to nothing about either character except brooding man lost family, fights crime. All the critical analysis you'd expect from a child. That's not fair. Sorry, that's not fair. I've known kids who can see the difference between the Punisher and Batman. And I think by now you see that the Punisher is neither efficient due to the consequences of his tactics, or a hero, since he increases bloodshed and perpetuates cycles of violence. He's a traumatized, unstable man, recreating and amplifying the symptoms of the system in which he was molded. This is the commentary Jerry Conway had in mind when he introduced the Punisher.
What you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you?
By the early 1990s, the Punisher was starring in 3 monthly comic series as well as a recurring series of one-shots. He also made cameo appearances in virtually every other title several times from 1991 to 93. In this era is where the phenomenon of men charged with protecting and serving our citizens really begins. Now that the Punisher was growing into one of Marvel's most popular characters, he was being noticed by comic fans in the military. The first fan letter from an active serviceman came in Punisher number 8, in a letter mostly talking about the choice of weapons that the Punisher used. There was no discussion of the ethics, or the methods, or the commentary of his agenda. It's no surprise that the Punisher was a hit with these men. The Punisher was one of the most prominent military veterans in comics, which was often a focal point of his ongoing series. At the peak of the Punisher's resurgence in the late 1980s, early 90s, untold dozens, maybe hundreds of fans got Punisher skull tattoos. It's reasonable to think many of them were servicemen. The most crucial milestone for the Punisher's use as a symbol arrived in the Iraq War in 2003. The poster boy for the war was Chris Kyle, the Navy SEAL who wrote the best-selling autobiography American Sniper. You know, the one that became a movie directed by Clint Eastwood, starring a fake baby. Oh, and also Bradley Cooper. Chris Kyle embraced the Punisher during his time in Iraq, saying later, "He righted wrongs. He killed bad guys. He made wrongdoers fear him. We spray painted the Punisher logo on our Hummers and our body armor, and our helmets, and all our guns. We spray painted it on every building or wall we could find. We wanted people to know we're here, and we want to fuck with you." The logo not only became ubiquitous among American armed forces in Iraq, it spread to the Iraqi military and its militias and police forces too, once US forces were training the Iraqis. This widespread popularity of the Punisher symbol was especially fascinating in Iraq because there wasn't a lot of pro-American sentiment in general, but their armed forces fully adopted the very American character and his iconic symbol. I guess the Iraqis are suckers for good branding just like us. Or they thought if they played nicely, we'd leave quickly. When the men and women returned home from overseas, many of them either joined their local police force or had strong ties to it. This is incredibly common, and the link between military and police is much stronger than the surface commonalities. The military mindset is ideal for what contemporary law enforcement seeks in officers, and their training is better than most police forces can hope to provide. By better, of course, I mean better for war and death, which is exactly why we see the shoot first, establish false narrative tactic so frequently at home. Many cops were already fans of the Punisher before his symbol became an accepted one with their peers and higher-ups. So it must have been a delight for those comic fanboy officers to finally be able to represent the skull. The widespread use of the skull during the war only increased the common recognition of it among cops at home. But that begs the question, do these officers know what the Punisher is actually about? Are they remotely aware of Frank Castle's narrative purpose, that of an indictment against the institution of which they are a part? Or did they just jump on a bandwagon with a totally rad edgelord symbol that only teenage boys take very seriously? One incident in 2004 may provide clues to an answer. The practice of Punisherizing the police first came to light in a negative way when a rogue group of Milwaukee cops started a vigilante group known as the Punishers. Geared up with black gloves and caps that featured the skull on them, the Punishers continued to operate through at least 2007, despite a number of inquiries into the group. In one instance from October 2004, a housewarming party by Milwaukee officer Andrew Spangler spiraled into criminality, cruelty, and vigilante mob violence. Frank Lee Jude, wow, there's so many Franks in this video, a black man, had been invited to the party by his friend, but felt uncomfortable around the partygoers, most of whom were off-duty police officers. Jude and his two friends headed home, but they were stopped shortly after by several people who had been at the party. These were all off-duty police officers. They claimed Jude had stolen Officer Spangler's wallet with his badge in it, and when Jude denied this, they proceeded to kick the shit out of him. The victims recall hearing one of the cops say as they were beating him, "N-word, we will kill you." Which reminds me of a line from HBO's True Detective.
Of course I'm dangerous. I'm police. I can do terrible things to people with impunity.
Frank Jude was arrested for suspicion of theft after the cops beat him on the ground for several minutes. His injuries were so numerous that the doctor had to take photographs of each just to remember where they were and how serious. Several of the officers involved in the beating of Frank Jude were part of the Punisher's crew. They were eventually convicted of civil rights violations and fired. However, documents released as part of Jude's civil action suit against the city and his attackers reveal that the Punishers may have remained active through 2008 despite having been stripped of their police authority. The badge in question was never found on Jude or his friends and never recovered elsewhere. And something tells me it was not really stolen and that the Punishers made sure it vanished. Captain James Galazewski investigated the Punishers once in 2005 and then again in 2007 and identified them as a real threat. He even went so far as to call the Punishers a gang. He also believed there to be more officers affiliated with this illegal group than just those involved in the Jude beating. Galazewski wrote in his report, "This is a group of rogue officers within our agency who I would characterize as brutal and abusive. At least some of the officers involved in the Jude case were associated with this group, although there is reason to believe the membership extended beyond those who were convicted in the case. Other than the firing of those officers who assaulted Frank Jude, nothing else was done in regard to the Punishers. The authority responsible for professional performance didn't even mention the group in its 82-page report on the beating, and the commander in charge of a 2008 investigation said he could not confirm the group even existed." However, Galazewski was never even asked for his information on the Punishers. Federal prosecutors didn't even mention the Punishers in the Jude trial. The assistant U.S. attorney later said, "We made a conscious decision to not use the Punishers' evidence." Captain Galazewski was quoted later as saying, "I am frankly alarmed that a group of officers might think of themselves in this light. I think a group like that, anything they stand for is pretty much outrageous. It shouldn't have any place in the Milwaukee Police Department." As of 2012, one member of the Punisher's crew remained on the force, a cop with a Punisher skull tattoo. In response to this, Captain Galazewski said He is sending a clear message that he has every intention of exercising his authority as a police officer in an inappropriate and abusive way, and in my judgment, it would be irresponsible to allow him that opportunity. At least in this case, it would appear the cops knew exactly what the Punisher is all about. Not only that, but they seem to fully embrace the vigilante mentality, the brutality, the extrajudicial methods employed by Frank Castle. These cops were fully aware of what they were doing, but believed themselves above the law, above decency, and beyond any measure of accountability. This is a recurring theme when we examine the institution of police across the US and many other nations. Agents in service of law, yet not bound to it. And when the rare moment comes that their tactics are exposed, a code of secrecy called the Blue Wall of Silence prevents any real accountability from happening. Okay, I promised to soothe your aching souls after an intense segment, and I'm a man of my word. Presenting Good Boys.
Good boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Good boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Good boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Good boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Good boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you?
The next landmark use of the Punisher as a police symbol is probably more familiar to you. In 2013, the Black Lives Matter campaign launched as activists tried to highlight the systemic racism and violence that African Americans face in the United States. The protesters particularly spotlighted police killings of African Americans, which in turn tied into protests against racial profiling, police brutality, and the overall mistreatment of African Americans within the American criminal justice system. Toward the end of 2014, a counter-movement debuted called Blue Lives Matter in response to the murders of 2 New York City police officers. The movement's stated goal is better protection for police officers by making it a hate crime to target police officers. But Blue Lives Matter is seen by anyone with a functioning moral compass as a cynical counter-propaganda campaign that utilizes racist talking points and tribal mentality to prevent Black Lives Matter from making any positive change toward policing in Black communities. Blue Lives Matter claims that Black Lives Matter is anti-police and pushes an anti-cop false narrative. Black Lives Matter is not anti-police, and unlike what some chuds on the internet like to say, it's definitely not a terrorist organization. The Black Lives Matter website explicitly addresses this assertion, saying, "This movement is not an anti-people movement. Therefore, it is not an anti-police officer movement. Most police officers are just everyday people who want to do their jobs, make a living for their families, and come home safely at the end of their shift." What Blue Lives Matter really represents is cops who see that their violence against African Americans and others might have to be answered for. They're frightened by the prospect of police departments having to treat people humanely and equally, and to not jump to using force as the first option. The headlines have been constant for years now. Black man killed by police, black man strangled by police in illegal chokehold, white officer acquitted of murder, white officer shoots black woman playing video games with her grandson, white officer shoots black man in his home after she enters the wrong apartment. It's everywhere, every corner of the US, and nothing is changing. Black Lives Matter is an honest response to a crisis, but Blue Lives Matter see it as a challenge to their hierarchy. The inclusion of the Punisher logo into Blue Lives Matter campaign coincided with the appearance of Jon Bernthal as Frank Castle on Netflix's Daredevil Season 2. Bernthal was asked about the appropriation of the symbol by white nationalists, as many were seen brandishing the logo at the Unite the Right rally and elsewhere. His response was apt. Fuck 'em. The fact that white nationalists and Nazis embrace it is a tragic misunderstanding. It's a misappropriation of the character and a blatant disregarding of reality. They literally do not know what they are fucking talking about. However, when asked specifically about police using Frank's symbol, Bernthal gave what can really only be seen as a PR-guided dodge of an answer. "I'm honored to play a guy who people putting their life on the line identify with. Look, I guess I wouldn't expect him to call the police out for this, though I would definitely have given him my respect. After all, we know cops love the Punisher, and it would be terrible PR if he just called out a chunk of his fan base before his own show even came to be. I mean, if he pissed off the white nationalists and the cops, the only audience he'd have left would be the 13-year-old boys. That's a joke, just a little joke. Even as recently as 2017, St. Louis area cops added the Punisher skull, complete with Blue Lives Matter slogan and flag decal, to 8 of its vehicles. The city council and mayor approved the designs, funded by local taxpayers. But we'll get into that in part 2, and a whole lot more. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get notifications when that video goes live. If you enjoyed this video, maybe consider becoming one of my Patreon supporters so that I can do this full time. And be sure to check out the merch store, grab a shirt. As the shirt says, peace, love, context.
Bad boys, what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you?
Jonah, your mystery man? His name's Frank Castle. He's a self-styled vigilante, calls himself the Punisher. He's wanted by the FBI, and even the CIA want him for questioning in the disappearances of various crime figures.
A crime fighter, huh?
He's known for using lethal force. He shoots first and never asks questions.